Thank you, Sangam Talks, for giving me an opportunity to talk on one of the important topics that are more or less ignored. So, in this day and age where everybody is going after artificial intelligence, space technology, drones, autopilot, and so on and so forth, why is philosophy important? And what is this thing called the greatest cover up or racism in philosophy? We all heard about, or most of the audience, especially of Sangam Talks, heard about the Aryan invasion theory, right? The Aryan invasion theory is basically the west to east migration of the so called Aryans, and that has been debunked for some time now. However, we tend to ignore a much bigger problem called Eurocentric philosophy, where everything that is worthy of inclusion in mainstream philosophy is of European in origin. That is the topic of today's discussion. Now, before we go into it, why is philosophy important? Why does it even matter? So, we all know that when somebody engages in a serious research study, they end up in an apex degree called PhD, right? We know that PhD is the apex degree. It's the highest level of degree that you get. Of course, you can do a postdoc and things like that in it, but that is the apex degree. PhD stands for, no matter what field of study you look at, you end up with a PhD if you are into research. But PhD stands for what? Doctorate in philosophy. Whether you are a space scientist or an economist or a financial expert or even an artist, if you do this type of research, you end up with a doctorate in philosophy. Now, why is a scientist a doctorate in philosophy? Right? So all scientists are philosophy doctorates. Now, philosophy is a human attempt to seek truths about ourselves, about the world that we live in, and the relationship between these two, which is why philosophy becomes so much more important in any field of inquiry. You take sociology, you might wonder what has philosophy to do with sociology, or you take space exploration, or you take microbiology. What has philosophy to do with microbiology? And yet, you end up with a doctorate in philosophy because philosophy is essentially a human attempt to understand ourselves in relationship with this world and where we stand in this cosmos. And philosophy is the basis of all aspects of human enterprise. It influences sociology, ethics, public policy, liberal arts, all sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, yes, and even technology. And that is why philosophy becomes important. Now, imagine a philosophy that is monolithic, that is monocular, that is univision, that only looks at one side of the picture. And that's exactly what we are doing right now. The philosophy that is taught in mainstream schools, academic institutions throughout the world is Eurocentric. That is, imagine a philosophy that is the foundation of public policy, ethics, sociology, technology, that is monolithic, that is monocular, that is Eurocentric. Everything that transpires out of these public policies, algorithms, ethics, and everything will become Eurocentric. And therefore, it's important to understand the kind of philosophy that we study because that influences every aspect of our lives. For decades, if not centuries, I would say at least 2 to 3 centuries, we were taught that philosophy started with the Greeks and spread eastwards. You see the analogy, you see the similarities to Aryan invasion theory, where everything started in the West and spread to the East and rest of the world. The same with the philosophy. When we engage in philosophical studies in schools, you and I, are more familiar with Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, Locke, Kant, Hegel, Karl Marx, and so on, and not so much how many of you, of course, your Sangam Talks audience may be more familiar with it, but our friends and colleagues and family members, how many of us are familiar with Kanada's Vaisheshika Darshana or Patanjali's yoga? I mean, of course, Patanjali's yoga has become more popular these days thanks to the West again, or Jaimini's Mimamsa, Kapila's Sankhya, and Nyaya Darshana. How many of us are familiar with this? You may be familiar with the word, with the names Jaimini, um, Kanada, Kapila, Patanjali, Adi Shankara, and so on and so forth, but we don't know what they actually said. And this is in toto missing in our mainstream philosophical canon. And we were taught that all philosophies are borrowed wisdom from the ancient Greeks and their successors. And we are thoroughly convinced. We are conditioned. We are brainwashed into accepting. It has become an accepted, received knowledge now. Everything that is worthy of study has to come from the Greeks. And now, the result of such a conditioning is we confuse Indian philosophy with Indian theology. Philosophy is different from theology, right? Philosophy is about reason, logic, dialectics, critical thinking. We heard about the term Mimamsa. It has been said that Asmin Vishaye, Rushayaha Mimamsante, Rushayaha Mimamsante means the learned people did critical analysis. Mimamsa, the word Mimamsa means vichara. Vichara means thinking, critical thinking using tarka, using logic. So, but we confuse philosophy with theology. Theos means God. Theology talks about mostly beliefs, rituals, festivals. If you are lucky, talks about Vedanta. However, there is a lot more to Indian philosophies too that we really are not exposed to. Indian philosophy is linked to mysticism and its sciences to quackery. Most of us take Ayurveda as some kind of quackery. In fact, it has a philosophy, it has great science behind it, but that science has not progressed the way it should have. And almost all of Indian philosophy is therefore unworthy of any serious study. And then there is a much bigger problem. We call Indian philosophy as wisdom tradition. In fact, most of the contemporary gurus call Indian knowledge systems as wisdom tradition. Now, what is the problem with it? When it comes to philosophy, it must involve two main aspects. One is logic and debate. Unless there is a debate, there is no advancement of philosophy or any thinking or any critical thinking. There should be logic behind the debate. Whereas wisdom tradition usually equates to received wisdom or accepted wisdom, that you should not question it. Calling Indian knowledge as wisdom tradition is reducing all reason and logic in it to something that is orthodox and therefore unworthy of serious consideration. So we have to be watchful when people say wisdom traditions. We got to be careful with what they actually mean by that. Or do they mean by it is simply reductionistic in the sense that it is a received or accepted wisdom, and therefore there is no scope for improvement, or is there logic and debate involved in it? Now, let us see what are the common areas of philosophy, and does Indian philosophy have anything to do with it? Do we see comparable areas in Indian darshanas? Darshana means that Drishyate iti darshana. The vision of the learned people is called darshana. It is roughly equated to philosophy. For our purpose today, we will call darshanas as philosophies. So the common areas of philosophy that we see are epistemology. It deals with the theory of knowledge. Questions such as how we know what we know, what are the sources of knowledge come under this area. What are the sources of knowledge? Direct perception, inference, comparison, expert review, expert opinion. These are all the sources of knowledge for any philosophy. In Indian darshanas, they are pratyaksha, anumana, upamana, ardhapatti, anupalabdhi, shabda pramana, or apta pramana. These are the types of pramanas. So this is epistemology. This is abundantly available in Indian philosophies, not just the Western or Eurocentric philosophies. Next comes metaphysics. Metaphysics deals with relationship between humans and nature and the higher governing power, if there is one. Again, Indian philosophies gave space for atheists and also theists, right? So atheists are charvakas, and then you have theists, well, who believe or who proposed or hypothesize that there is a higher governing power. And of course, I'm not going to go into greater detail in it, which has been dealt with by Vedantins. But there is, what I meant to say is metaphysics is greatly dealt in Indian philosophies. And now comes ethics. Ethics, of course, we know that there is so much ethics in Indian philosophies. Itihasas talk about ethics. Puranas talk about ethics. Shastras, Dharma Shastras talk about ethics. So ethics deals with the question of good and evil, right or wrong, the moral code, the law, the moral code that has instructions regarding, free will. Is there a free will or not? Who is the agency that has a free will? All these things are greatly dealt in with within ethics. So that is extensively covered in Indian philosophies. And now comes ontology. Ontology are the questions relating to existence itself, such as what is reality? Is it a matrix that we live in? Is this real or is it a dream? These things are dealt in greater detail in our Vedanta, Sankhya, and so on. So we have abundant knowledge in our own darshanas. And then logic. We crudely equate Nyaya and Vaisheshika together as Tarka, as logic. But Nyaya Vaisheshika, which includes Navya Nyaya or Tarka, has a lot more than logic. For example, there is an art of debate in Nyaya that they talk about. In fact, the Nyaya, this art of debate, which is Vada, also another name for is Katha, which is debating. It has been extensively studied by Nyaya philosophers and other schools of Indian philosophies. And in fact, Charaka mentions in his Charaka Samhita in greater detail about how to conduct a debate. Why is Charaka talking about debate? Because that's important to advance the understanding of medical knowledge. Debating is quintessential, is crucial to advance our sciences. And it seems that by the time of Charaka himself, there was this great art of debate going on between medical philosophies and medical scientists of the antiquity. So we see these all areas of these Eurocentric or Western philosophies very much dealt with in Indian Darshana. So there should not be any reason why Indian philosophies are not part of mainstream philosophies. And we will get to why it has been omitted and who did it. Now, Nyaya, as we talked about, in Bharatiya's philosophical landscape, Nyaya deals with logic, Sankhya deals with ontology, Mimamsa with ethics, Vedanta with metaphysics. And of course, in all these, you come across epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge, where I mentioned about pramanas, different pramana. Pramana is the source of valid knowledge, perception, pratyaksha, anumana, which is inference, pratyaksha, anumana, upamana, which is comparison, anumana, and then shabda or apta pramana, which is expert opinion, and so on. We have abundance of those. Yoga talks about yoga and Sankhya. If yoga is the practical side of it, Sankhya is the theoretical side of it, talks about human psychology. Vaiseshika talks about matter, anu, and so on. And each school of thought, whether you talk about, I didn't mention about what are these Nyaya, Sankhya, Mimamsa, and all that. When we talk about Indian knowledge or Indic knowledge systems, most of the time, there is this 6 darshanas that we mentioned. Shad darshanas. Shad means 6, darshana means vision, the way we see the world, the way we see ourselves. So there are 6 main darshanas that we study in Indian schools of wisdom or philosophies: Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Sankhya, Yoga, Purva Mimamsa, and Uttara Mimamsa. Uttara Mimamsa is Vedanta, Purva Mimamsa is by Jaimini, Sankhya is by Kapila, Nyaya is by Gautama, Vaisheshika is by Kanada, and so on. So each school of this thought actually depend on the other schools to arrive at these conclusions. They are not independent. They are interdependent schools of thought. But what happened when these Western Indologists in the 1800s and 1900s started translating them into English from Sanskrit, because all these were written in Sanskrit, right? So when they translated them, they started pitting one school against each other. They started saying, oh, Nyaya says this, but that doesn't agree with Sankhya. The problem with such a translation is that these Western Indologists did not understand the spirit of behind these philosophies. They are not supposed to be pitting one against each other, but they are in fact complementary to each other. What they do is they develop their own field of expertise. Nyaya, for example, deals with logic. It's only interested in logic, debate, tarka, and so on. Sankhya deals with ontology. It is not interested in what Nyaya has to say. Mimamsa talks about ethics. Vedanta talks about metaphysics. And so when Vedanta and when the Western Indologists pit Vedanta against Sankhya, they did not understand the spirit behind it, because Vedanta is a completely different specialization. And they used a lot of Sankhyan terms such as three gunas, right? Sattva, Rajas, and Tamo gunas, and so on. That is actually from Sankhyan. Sankyans are the skeptics of the antiquity. They questioned everything. They did not simply take received knowledge and use it. They questioned everything. Sankyans are what I consider the oldest skeptics that human civilization have produced. And Vedanta has taken so much from Sankhya and used that. For example, when we talk about antahkarana means the inner karana is the anta means inside, karana means the inner workings, right? Inner workings of our mind. In fact, there is no English equivalent to it. Mano, buddhi, ahankara, chittam together is called antahkarana. Manas, buddhi, ahankara, and chittam. There are no English equivalents to these terms, and therefore they simply dismissed it. But when you actually go into our Indian Vedanta or Sankhya, you will actually start seeing these divisions within our mind. And at the same way, you have what is called different layers of human psychobiology, such as koshas, Annamaya Kosha, Pranamaya, Manomaya, Vijnanamaya, Anandamaya Koshas. So what medical science does is it addresses mostly the Annamaya Kosha, the matter part of it. When you talk about putting stents, or when you talk about doing a bypass surgery or removing kidney stones or talking about liver, kidney, heart, brain, strokes, and so on and so forth, it is the matter part of it. And that is the Annamaya Kosha. So I mean, in Indian philosophy, they have different layers of uh, human human biology or human psychology. So all this has been dealt with, and yet with so much knowledge, with so much mimamsa, with so much critical analysis, debate, dialectics, and so on, Bharat's philosophies are still not part of mainstream philosophy of the world. I have identified three reasons for that. In my upcoming book on Indian philosophies, I've written in greater detail, but for today's talk, I'm going to focus on reason number one, which is racism in philosophy. So the three reasons that I have identified why Bharat's philosophies are not part of mainstream and why they should be is racism in philosophy. Number two is seeing Indian philosophies through European lens. If you look at Indian philosophies, which is multi-dimensional through one monocular mono vision, you will only see one color, the exclusion of everything else. So you don't get the big picture. And that is reason number two. Reason number three is misinterpreting, either unknowingly or deliberately, misinterpreting the meaning of the concepts in Indian philosophies. See, I mentioned earlier, most of the Indologists, so who is an Indologist, right? So an Indologist is a person who studies Indian knowledge systems from primary sources such as Vedas and Upanishads. So they actually go to the primary sources and not from the secondary sources. They go to the not from somebody else's translation. They go to the primary source and get the knowledge and study it. He or she is the true Indologist, and for that they need to have a good. They need two things. One is they need to understand the language in which it is written, which is Sanskrit, and they need to have a living experience. They need to actually live the culture to understand what they mean. Simply studying the language is not enough. Simply living here in India is not enough. You have to have both. So most of the Indologists lack adequate knowledge of Sanskrit and adequate experience, adequate living experience. And yet they are the authorities, and they misinterpret either deliberately or unknowingly the concepts impregnated in Indian philosophies. These are the three reasons that, of course, there may be minor other reasons that you may identify, but these are the three main reasons that I have identified. Number one, racism in philosophy. This gets more interesting. Peter Park, an assistant professor of historical studies at University of Texas, had written an interesting, and in fact, it's a very important book. I recommend the audience to get a hold of this book, at least the summary of this book, to see, to uncover the greatest cover up in the history of philosophy. His book is titled Africa, Asia, and the History of Philosophy, Racism in the Formation of Philosophical Canon. So watch this carefully. Racism in the Formation of Philosophical Canon. He covers the period between 1780 to 1830, just 50 years, but he does a great job. He shows how European philosophers of the late 18th and 19th centuries overturned the existing landscape of the philosophical history and made it Eurocentric by excluding Asian philosophies and their original contribution to the field of philosophy. Now, Dan Flory, he's a professor who teaches philosophy of race at Montana University. He mentions that the stakes of this debate, the debate meaning the philosophical history, the history of philosophy, this debate is, is important. The stakes of this debate were and remain extraordinarily high. For in the late 18th and early 19th century, the claims of originality and invention of philosophy, including, we should note, what later became natural as well as social sciences, including medical science, technology, philosophy, ethics, social sciences, sociology, all of this, the bedrock of all this was made Eurocentric. Prior to 1700s, it was not. We'll see what it was in the next three slides. And so the stakes of this debate are high. And he argues that the overall argument was racial white supremacy for this uh, overturning or conversion. Now, what is the original philosophy? Prior to the 18th century, specifically pre-1780s, majority of the European, see, in this, watch what I title here, Asia-centric. The original history was Asia-centric. Prior to the 18th century, specifically pre-1780s, majority of the European philosophers agreed that philosophies originated in the Orient. They used to call East as Orient in the past. Okay, the terms such as Orient, Asia Minor, they have all been gone in the literature now. But if you look at the older textbooks, you will see terms like Orient, which means East. So prior to the 18th century, majority of the European philosophers agreed that philosophies originated in the East, and from there, knowledge migrated to Persia and Egypt, and from there, it was picked by Ionian philosophers like Pythagoras, who settled and spread that knowledge to the ancient Greece. So actually, knowledge migrated from the East to West, and from there, it spread to the rest of the world again. If you look at the older philosophers, like before 1700s, you will see 17 or 1800s, you will see one Thomas Hobbes, who wrote in 1651 in Leviathan. Here, first were great and flourishing cities. There was first the study of philosophy. The gymnosophists of India. Gymnos means naked, like semi-naked sadhus of Jains, or we see sadhus who are the Brahmins, and the sadhus who are semi-naked. Gymnos means naked. Sophists means are good orators who speak well, who are teachers. The gymnosophists of India, the Magi of Persia, the priests of Egypt are counted as the most ancient philosophers. And from there, the world derived knowledge. So that is Thomas Hobbes. And then you have George Berkeley in the mid 18th century saying it is allowed by all that Greeks derived much of their philosophy from the Eastern nations. So the Greeks derived much of their philosophy from the Eastern nations. So this Asia-centric philosophy was changed to Eurocentric philosophy. We'll see how. Now, we see this is the new history. This is the distorted history, which is now Eurocentric. Peter Park mentions in his book that the prominent European philosophers, Immanuel Kant, George Hegel, etc., beginning in the 18th century till the current date, cleverly revised this westward migration of knowledge and firmly declared that all philosophy originated in the Greeks and spread eastwards. You see this, just like Aryan migration theory, you'll see this philosophy migrated from the east to the west. Now, these are some of the quotes by the famous Kantian and Hegelian, from Kant and Hegel, Kantian and Hegelian philosophers. This is the reversal of the earlier position. Indian art, religion, and philosophy lacked maturity in concept and practice. And although German Romanticism had enthusiastically hailed India as the land of origins, origins means the land of origin of philosophy, Europe has long and rightfully overcome it. That is George Hegel. And then you see Bertrand Russell, philosophy as distinct from theology began in Greece in the 16th century. Somehow everybody feels like everything originated starting from the 6th century BC in the Greece. Philosophy, art, sciences, medicine, everything originated somehow in the 16th century. And all these philosophers are convinced and brainwashed into thinking, including us these days. Then Peter Adamson, in his 2014 classical philosophy, he wrote about history of philosophy without any gaps. So the people started writing history of philosophy, mentioning that our story, meaning the story of the world, began in the 6th century BC with Thales, the first ever philosopher. 6th century BC, Thales, he is considered the first ever philosopher, and the world began to accept this. Forget about Patanjali, Panini, Vatsayana, Kanada, Patanjali, Jaimini. Everybody is gone. Nobody appears in the philosophical canons anymore. It is the Thales or the Thales, Pythagoras, Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, and now Kant, Hegel, and so on. And Catherine Osborne in 2004 observes or mentions some bright sparks on the eastern edges of Greek world invented philosophy. So they cannot dismiss that there is an Eastern influence, and yet they say that it is still the Greek that invented the philosophy. And so you see this overturning of tables here from the Oriental origin of philosophy to the Eurocentric version of the philosophy, where everything originated in the Greece. And now the distortion continues. In a coordinated campaign, these German philosophers, so it started in the 17th and 18th century, and the Kant and Hegelian schools of thought and their successors, especially two of them, Christoph Wiener and Wilhelm Tennemann, and the like, who are influenced by Kant and Hegel, produced numerous publications favoring exclusion of Asia's contribution. So they made a conscious and a massive attempt by writing, producing a lot of work in the literature and speaking widely in the circles, in the academic circles, that Asia has nothing to do with philosophy, they're unworthy of philosophical studies, and therefore needs to be excluded completely from the mainstream philosophy. If you want to study Asian philosophy um, as a minor or as a elective, it's okay to do it, but that's not part of the mainstream philosophy, right? So that is how they excluded ancient Asia's contribution. The same influencers, these guys, who the German philosophers, the British philosophers, and European philosophers, they were also successful in excluding Asia's contribution to the history of sciences. Ganita Shastra, the invention of zero, cosmology, the debunking of the heliocentric theory, the atomism of Kanada, the mind body spirit theories of Ayurveda, Charaka, Sushruta, all of these from astronomy, mathematics, and medicines is all excluded from the philosophical. And therefore, we talked about why the bedrock of sciences is philosophy, right? So if your sciences do not have your philosophy, then that part is missing. So all of our sciences, the current sciences we deal with, is Eurocentric, and in that there is no Asiatic philosophy in it or Indian philosophy in it, and therefore it will be missing of all contribution from the Asian philosophers. Now it doesn't end there. The Kantian and Hegelian philosophers, which means Kant, Immanuel Kant, and Hegel, took upon themselves the role of custodians of true philosophy by providing arguments and justifying their positions to create an indisputable position of European reason by affirming that no non-European group could develop true philosophy. Nobody is unworthy of developing true philosophy except the European philosophers. And this resulted in complete absence of Asian. Which, when I say Asian thought, you have to include the Chinese also. They're also great philosophers. Of course, we talk about Indian philosophies because we know a great detail about them, and less because I'm a medical doctor. I'm based in United States, and I have studied Ayurveda. I have studied Chinese philosopher, Chinese medicine, including acupuncture and Chinese traditional medicine and so on. They do have great philosophy. Of course, there is a lot of similarities, and it has been said that a lot of sciences or the philosophy originated from India and spread to Asiatic countries such as China, Japan, through Buddhism in the 5th to 7th century through Chinese travelers. I'll give you an interesting real life example. When I was treating my patients, one of my professors, she's an English professor, she's an American professor, Caucasian professor. So she does acupuncture, but she also uses chakras and things like that. She's an allopathic medicine physician. One of my professors who was actually retiring, she would use a combination of what we call integrated medicine. And I asked her one day, why do you mix Chinese medicine and Indian medicine? And she looked at me and said, Rajiv, you should be knowing this. You are from India. Don't you know that all sciences originated from India and spread to the rest of the world? And therefore, if you touch Indian science, you have touched the rest of all the sciences. And I kind of felt ashamed because I should be knowing this, right? And yet I don't. And most of us don't. And so we should be ashamed that we don't know. And part of it is because of how the distortion of the history happened. And because we don't know about our philosophies. In fact, Rabindranath Tagore lamented on this. And he had written extensively on this. Of course, we know Vivekananda did the same. And yet, even in 2023, we still are ignorant about our own philosophies. And now we know the reason, because of the distortion of the philosophical canon itself. Philosophical canon means the entire canon of philosophy that people study in academic schools. And now, so I'm coming towards the end of my talk here. So I will wrap it up with a few ideas of the importance of Indian philosophy. Now we know from this talk, at least we got an introduction of why the current version of philosophy is monocular, monolithic. However, we live in a multicultural world, right? When we live in a multicultural world, we need multicultural philosophy in the philosophical canons to understand how cultures think, how nations behave, anything from public policy to medical knowledge, or how medical treatment has to be implemented, to transportation, and even to gender debate. You need indigenous, you need native cultural behavior rather than borrowing it from Eurocentric, borrowing it from the West, and then just superimposing on a culture that is not based on Eurocentric values. And yet we do that. So that is a shame that we do it. We do that. So the second observation that I made is, well, let me give specific example. If you look at the philosophy of medicine, you talk about personalized medicine, right? Without knowing the culture of the people, how can you personalize a medicine? And when you want to personalize medicine, you need to understand the philosophy behind it. I'm not going to go into more detail on the philosophy behind Indian medicine or Chinese medicine, because that would be a whole different topic. And now, another example would be consciousness studies. In America, United States, and the West, there is a whole lot of study going on consciousness studies. They call it the big problem. And yet, none of these neuroscientists are exposed to what Vedanta has to say. Vedanta talks a great deal about consciousness, which is actually very relevant in the field of quantum mechanics, quantum physics, and so on. The only consolation that we have is from Dalai Lama and these Rinpoche, some of these Tibetan Buddhists, they introduce some of these consciousness studies into the West, and therefore some of these neuroscientists who are more open to these consciousness studies, who are more multicultural, talk about it. And yet nobody talks about, no conscientious or no serious neuroscientist talks about the importance of Vedanta and what has been said by the philosophers. And then we have this art of debate in Nyaya. Nyaya's art of debate is very interesting. In fact, it should be included in all high school and college studies, the art of debate in Nyaya. So let me give you in a couple minutes the art of debate, what Nyaya, what our darshanas talk about debate. There are three types of debate, the three common types of debate called Vada, Jalpa, and Vitanda. Of course, there is Chala, Hetva, Basa, and so on. I'm going to focus on Vada, Jalpa, and Vitanda. So when you engage, this is very practical. In fact, you might use it in your daily life. When you engage in a debate where the outcome is knowledge, you want to learn something, you want to solve a problem. For example, you have a question, you go to your teacher, you go to your professor, and you ask a question. There is a constructive debate that is going on, question answer. That is called Vada. The outcome of Vada is advancement of knowledge. The second type of debate is called Jalpa. Jalpa means I have a position and I'm constantly defending my position and I am constantly attacking you. The goal is to win the argument. I want to win this argument. This is called Jalpa. So I know your viewpoint, but I am very steadfast in winning my argument. That is Jalpa. And then there is a third type of debate called Vitanda. Vitanda is I don't have a viewpoint. I don't have a hypothesis. There is no theory. And yet I want to shoot you down. I want to shoot your viewpoint. That is called Vitanda. So most of the political debates that happen on TVs is Vitanda. Sometimes Jalpa, right? So they may not have a viewpoint. They may have a, let us say, a party may have certain policies or certain ideas, ideals, but in a particular area of interest, they may not have a viewpoint, and yet they want to shoot you down, or the shoot in the sense not metaphorically shoot you down, the opponent. So that is, most of these are engaged in Jalpa or Vitanda. So if you recognize that, you can see, you can actually study the psychology of the opponent and then tackle in a more psychological, you can involve and you can do the mind games with the opponent if you understand what type of debate he or she is involved, Vada or Jalpa or Vitanda, right? So this art of debate is extensively studied in Nyaya and other schools of thought. So it becomes so much more important. It's actually fun. See, I'm a medical doctor. I work full time. I did an MA in Sanskrit, and I have learned a lot. I use it see, this art of debate I use with my patients. No matter what profession you are in, you could be a lawyer. I mean, this works great if you understand the art of debate. You could be an IT professional. You want to sell a product or you want to procure a project from a vendor. Then you understand all this. You understand the psychology involved behind it, and you talk in a way that you understand the psychology of the vendor. by learning this art of debate from Indian philosophies. So no matter what profession you are in, you may be in technology, space technology, automobile technology, and what have you, and still, if you understand the Indian philosophies, it will still serve you great. So I'm going to stop here, and let me summarize real quick. So we have seen why is philosophy important? Because it's a bedrock of all sciences. And if that bedrock, if the foundation of all sciences is Eurocentric, everything that comes out of it is going to be Eurocentric. If it is uh, based on the indigenous philosophy, everything that comes out of it is going to serve that indigenous population better, rather than superimposing some other's culture, some other's philosophy on us or on some other population. So, of course, so that is point number three, multicultural approach. And therefore, it's important to reverse the current uh, philosophical Eurocentric canon and include Indian philosophies into the mainstream philosophical canon. So I'm going to stop here, and if there are any questions, comments, they're welcome at this point.
Namaste, Rajiv ji. Thank you. Very interesting presentation. I'll have to listen to it again when it's uploaded to take in a bit more of the stuff.
Thank you.
I really appreciate the way you have put it throughout the slides. There was one thing that I recognize you were saying, like quite a few reasons of why Indian philosophies need to be included. It should be multicultural, locally relevant. There's another point that came to my mind was because if there are different philosophies from different regions included, then it becomes easier to see how philosophy A from region A might be missing something that's there in B that will better cater to the human needs. Like, for example, which you also touched upon, and I was aware of that before. Like, they in the Western medicine, they only look primarily at the matter and the Annamaya kosha. Whereas you have 5 koshas, and if you don't know about the philosophy of another culture that has 5 koshas, how will you recognize that you're not seeing the holistic picture, but just a component of it? That was one. There was another thing that I had a slightly different thought, but I'm happy for you to expand on this. You mentioned that wisdom is only received wisdom or practice wisdom, like, accepted wisdom. So it sounded more like a passive activity, but my understanding of our knowledge is that it's not just about that, it's about the different aspects that we deal with on the outer surface. There are hidden aspects which help us live our lives with a lot more sense. So logic, reasoning, other practices are means to deriving the wisdom that lies underneath them. And so there's no real distinction between logic and wisdom in that. Logic doesn't exist in a compartmentalized space where wisdom cannot be derived from logic, if that makes sense. I don't know if what I observed clashes with how you view things, and I wondered about your thoughts.
Before you go to the next question, let me because this is an important thing that I want to clarify. Let me come to point number 2, your question number 2. When we say received wisdom, you are exactly correct in what you said. Received wisdom should, most of what happens in the West, when I live in America, right? I've been there since 2001, 23 years. So I have some interaction. I have a lot of interaction because I see patients, I talk to their families, I talk to about 50 to 60 people every single day, seeing patients and their families. So when I talk to them, or when I look at the landscape, when people say received wisdom, they usually equate that to paganism. So but that is not true, like you said, but that is the perception. So the perception is anything that is received wisdom is accepted, or anything that is wisdom is accepted, which is not true, but that is the perception. Whereas if you say philosophy, that involves logic, debate, reasoning, critical thinking, and so on and so forth. So when I come across, Indian yoga is a part of wisdom tradition coming from India, which simply means that you don't need to question it. You just accept it as a received wisdom. Whereas when I say Indian yoga is based on a philosophy called Sankhya, and Sankhya has an entire philosophy, and the practical side of that is yoga, and that gives a much bigger picture, and that tells us there is a lot more behind the yoga than just wisdom. So I hope I'm clear here, rather than, I don't want to confuse the audience by saying wisdom is has nothing to do with logic, but the perception is there in the West.
Yes,
Makes sense?
absolutely. I understand that. My other observation probably relates to the same thing which you mentioned, that there's a difference between theology and philosophy. Now, I know that theology obviously is an English word and has its origins, and it comes from Deus and God, but I don't exactly know the details of it. But I guess this comment was probably falling along the lines of the same thing that you said before, because I was thinking our idea of God is not about a belief system anyway, and the way we believe anything is not the same. Our idea of belief is not the same as the West, in that our understanding is that we have an ego and personality which comes away from how our atman is, and in submitting that we get to recognize our atman, and through that we can connect with the brahman, which is not a belief system at all. And the submission is not about there is a God and I just believe him and I submit. It's about, oh, there's our ego that's coming in the way of us understanding ourselves, this world, and our place in it, and is preventing us from getting the knowledge and wisdom that we are very much capable of and will help us live a better life. So we give up the ego, and that's how you end up submitting to quote unquote our idea of God, the Indian idea of God. So it's
Right.
different from their idea of
Right.
theology versus philosophy. I was a bit confused. I was wondering.
Yeah, you are very true. But when you go to the schools, academic schools, this is what they teach you. That is what I was saying. This is what they don't talk about the Atman and the ego and this and that you're talking about. Of course, they talk about free will. Does it exist or not? That is a whole different concept. But Aditi ji, you are so much more knowledgeable than any average, even average Indian, forget about average European or Westerner, about our philosophy. So what I said, um, you see, when somebody talks, people take it based on their level of knowledge. So you are taking so much more from what I have said, and I really appreciate that. Because, for example, you talked about atman, right? So what is an atman? There is a definition for atman. In fact, when we equate it to spirit, it reduces it to everything as something that is ephemeral, which is not immaterial or non-material. But our shastras, for example, Tattva Bodha defines Atman as sthula sukshma, स्थूल सूक्ष्म शरीरा व्यतिरिक्तः पंचकोशातीतः अवस्थात्रय साक्षी सच्चित आनंद रूप सन् यतिष्ठति सा आत्मा स्थूल सूक्ष्म कारण शरीराद व्यतिरिक्तः पंचकोश अतीतः स्थूल सूक्ष्म शरीराद व्यतिरिक्तः पंचकोश अतीतः अवस्थात्रय साक्षी three अवस्थात्रय साक्षी the witness of the three avasthas Sat Chit Ananda Rupa San Yat Tishtati Sa Atma, the one that is Sat Chit Ananda, that is Atma. And then you look at Advaita Vedanta or Shankaracharya, and then he talks about Manobuddhyahankara Chittanina Hamna Chasrotra Jifena Chagrana Netrena Chavyoma Bhumirna Tejona Vayu Chidananda Rupa Shivoham Shivoham. So he talks about mano buddhi ahankara chittani naham na chastrotra jihve na chagrana netre na chavyoma bhumir na tejona vayuhu na tejona vayuhu chidananda rupa shivoham shivoham. So all this is consciousness studies, and we yet don't do this in any of even Indian schools or philosophical studies. And we simply say that, oh, Shankaracharya is a god, and we put him up on the pedestal, and we pray for him, we pour milk on him, and we do not understand the philosophy, the deep, core, beautiful philosophy that Adi Shankara said. See him as a philosopher, not as God. Of course, you can see him as a God, because when we see our mother, sometimes we call our mother as God, our parents. as gods, right? Jagatah Pitaro Vande, Parvati Parameshwaro. Kalidasa says that. So, so we see our God, mother and father as gods, but at the same time, they're humans, right? So Shankaracharya could be God, and he's a great philosopher. Look at the philosophy that they said, what Kanada said, what Jaimini said, what Patanjali said. So this becomes so unless we bring all these philosophies down to the common man and explain it, that we will remain the way we are. We will remain Eurocentric. We will never grow. We'll be a copycat people. See, in the last 1500 years, or yeah, last 1500 years, how many patents did we produce? What is the level of innovation India has produced? It has been a copy and copying and copying. We have become so good at copying that we have excelled at it. We become better. We make better products after copying. Of course, I'm not saying we should not do it because everybody does it. But at the same time, we ignored the treasure that we are sitting on. We are like beggars sitting on a treasure and asking people for ideas and going away from. See, I went away from India 23 years ago because I did not know. After having gone there, I got a chance to look back and see, oh, this is what we have been missing all this time, and this is what we need to focus on. And that is why I started writing books, talking, did a master's in Sanskrit, and so on and so forth. And I felt that we need to share this knowledge. You and me, Aditi ji, you have to share this knowledge. Dr. Prashant, Tanmay, Srinivasa, all these people, we have to, of course, Ojaswi ji, you are doing a great job. So it is upon us to uncover this knowledge and share. See, we are speaking English, so there is no excuse to go to the West and talk to the English people. We shouldn't be ashamed about it, right? Anyway, so I think that's a long-winded answer to a short question.
A very enriching and thought-provoking session, Rajiv sir. I'm really thankful to you. I have two queries in particular, and that is exactly pertaining to your slides. Number one, as we sometimes claim, or maybe the major commentators claim, that most of the Western philosophy is coming from India. Now, there are particular experts on Greek philosophy who say, like W.T. Stace and Frederick Copplestone, that and there is an additional remark made by Professor U.P. Arora from JNU, who was an expert on Greek philosophy, that it would be like over-exaggerating when we say that whether the Greeks were influenced by India or maybe India was influenced by Greeks, because there is high possibility that at the two corners of the world, the intellectuals were thinking alike. So what I want to say here is that I'm sorry, but I use particularly the Hindi word which says neither we should be self-glorifying ourselves, आत्ममुग्धता भी नहीं होनी चाहिए, nor we should be feeling ashamed of what we are doing, आत्मग्लानि भी नहीं होनी चाहिए. We are as exclusive as others. And there are some commentators who do not start even with Greek. They have their own pride and say, we start with Bacon and Descartes. So what about those commentators?
So in our Rigveda itself, it has been said that Ano Bhadraha Kratavoyantu Vishwataha, which means let knowledge come from all directions to us. So we are not limited to our own indigenous knowledge. We welcome knowledge from all sides of the world. It has been mentioned in the Vedas itself, in the Rigveda itself, which is quite popular. What is Ano Bhadraha Kratavoyantu Vishwataha. So what you said is absolutely true. We should not glorify ourselves by saying that everything that the world is important in the world has come from India. No, it did not, because it's a collective enterprise. When we say India, the current boundaries of India were not the same when we look at the Bharat or Bharatavarsha some 2000 years ago. It was an Indian subcontinent, and which extended all the way from Burma, Malaysia, and almost into the Japan-China borders to here, Persia, Egypt, Turkey, and so on and so forth. So it was a collective wisdom of all these people And in fact, there was exchange of ideas. So I live in, like I said, I live in US, which is a great country with a lot of weaknesses, right? And India is a great civilization with a lot of challenges. So it is always important that we learn from each other and yet recognize that there is a role for these philosophies in the mainstream canon. That is my point. So complete exclusion of any other philosophy from the philosophical canon is my problem. Complete Eurocentricity is the problem. So you have to say, you have to include at least some portions of Indian philosophy and say that, hey, here is a great civilization that has produced a lot of sciences, a lot of philosophy behind it. If you're interested, you go and pursue more into it, rather than saying that that's not important. Those people have nothing to do with the mainstream canon. That was my point.
Namaskaram, sir. Sir, my question is, sir, most of the things are of the Vedas are lost, sir, after Islamic invasion. So, sir, how are Shrutis connected with Sir Vedas? Sir, is it, sir, can we say that, sir, all the Shrutis, sir, they are, sir, authentic and, sir, they are related to, sir, Vedas? And, sir, especially, sir, controversial one, sir, which is, sir, Manu Smriti, sir. I'm not, sir, saying this, but, sir, most of the people, sir, raise this concern.
So the word Shruti means Veda. Shruti means that which is heard, right? Shruti is synonymous with the Vedas. You are right. Most of the Vedas is lost. It has been said that what is left now is only 0.1%. Is only 1% of what was available, not 0.1%. It's 1% what was available. Patanjali in his Mahabhashya and many others who belong, before the Common Era, 2000 years ago, they mentioned the number of Brahmanas and Samhitas in their textbooks. And when you compare, so at that time, 2000 years ago, what was available to what is available now, we have lost significant amount of the Vedas. So Vedas are the Shrutis. Shruti means that which is heard. Vedas are called Apaurushaya, means they're not of a human origin. Of course, that I'm not going to talk about why or whether or not they're of human origin. That is a different discussion. But Shruti, that is Shruti, Vedas. Smriti is different. Smriti are Paurishayas. Smritis are Dharmashastras and so on and so forth. They talk about the do's and don'ts of the social life. They talk about dharma. What is dharma? Dharanat dharma muchyate. Means that which binds the society together, the rules, the laws, the do's and don'ts that bind the society together. They are called the Dharma Shastras. They are the Shmrutis. Manusmruti is one of the famous, Yagnavalkya Shmruti, and so on. There are dozens of such Shmrutis are there. So I think your question is, haven't we lost so much? Yes, we did. What is the difference between Vedas and the Shmruti? No difference, or Shruti, no difference. They're the same. I think that addresses your question.
Thank you, Raju. Fascinating question. Fascinating issues you have taken up. And I've just retired from Jawaharlal Nehru University for 43 years of service there as a professor and a philosophy professor. And I recall that towards the end of 19th century, Europe started accepting that there may be different kinds of views which have truth contents, and the very strong truth contents than only what Europe has it. So they started coming to terms with plurality. Before that, they thought that plurality means some kind of relativism, which is a bad taste of philosophizing. So because they had that, theological notion that truth has to be only one kind of a thing. That truth can be of many kinds. And this is the legacy, this is the philosophical thinking towards which they started, coming to terms towards the end of 19th century. And in some of the lectures at UMass and other places, so I have raised this question that how many kinds of pluralities are there? Plurality is a fact in nature, it is in the society. So philosophy has to cognize it, articulate it, express it. And you just cannot arbitrarily say that that truth is only one kind of an entity. So then I look at Vedanta philosophy. There we find that there is a way of going from one to many, like in Advaita Vedanta. We go from one to many. And we have Sankhya philosophy and even Nyaya philosophy, Vaisheshik also, where we go from many to many. So many entities are already there, 2 entities are there, 3 or 4 substances are there, but we go to many more, kind of a thing. Also in the Vallabha Vedanta, we find that we go from many to one. Like in Bhakti Vedanta, there may be many gopis, but Krishna is one.
Like
So we
Pushtiman.
go from many to one. And then there is a very difficult term which we find in Buddhist philosophy, in which we go from nothing to many, Swabhava Shunya, kind of a thing. Now, some of my lectures at School of Divinity and also in the Center for Indic Studies at University of Massachusetts and everything. So, there people could understand it. But at Frankfurt University, nobody could understand that how to go from nothing to many, from Swabhava Shunya. When I took the example of Buddhism and try to substantiate it, now they are getting acquainted with this also. That there is a Buddhist philosophy with the Dalai Lama getting Nobel Prize. So it became a very passionate kind of a thinking. Yeah. So how do you look at this? Because if they accept plurality, that there are many viewpoints, then India has a role to play, and there will definitely be a U-turn in philosophy. Because ekam sad viprahava udha badant, and you have already said ano bhadra krizo yantu visvadha. This has been the act of philosophy right from the beginning in India. So in fact, I appreciate, I fully agree with your contention. This is just like some kind of an observation which I wanted to place before you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Singh, for such a insightful comments. So I think what they're doing now in your circle, we all live in our little own bubbles, right? So in your circle, so I wish that happens across the world, where plurality, multiculturalism, multi-centric views, and then of course focused on what is specific to their environment, to their culture, that becomes important. And another interesting thing you mentioned about Buddhism and others. So you probably know about Jain philosophy too, right? So Jains have these 2 foundational philosophies or concepts called Syadvada and Anekantavada. Syadvada means Syat. It's possible. This is possible. That is possible. So they are very open. So Jain philosophers are extraordinary intellectuals. We tend to think of Jains as, they don't eat meat, they're vegetarians, they don't eat after midnight, after evening, and things like that. But that below all of that, at the core of their philosophy, they have what is called Syad. Syad in Sanskrit, Syad means possible, Syadvada and Anekantavada. Multiple viewpoints they consider. So this is the core of our Indian philosophy, where you can take them, you can use them to create policies, procedures, and things like that. In fact, if you do that, you will get more personalized medicine. The Aditi ji was mentioning about personalized medicine. I didn't have time to talk about it. The reason why we do not have personalized medicine is because we excluded this from the philosophical canon. Once you start including these into the philosophical canon, it becomes the bedrock of the sciences that we build upon it, and personalized medicine will happen. Of course, you can have genetics, we can have technology, we can have artificial intelligence, everything on top of it, but at the bottom of it, you need something that is more, which has a much bigger vision than in just one narrow vision. So anyway, thank you, Dr. Singh.
Rajiv ji, just one last question is, people who don't have the opportunity to study Sanskrit, what is the best way for them to start reading about these, the different knowledge systems, the Shat Darshana or the Vedas? If you have any suggestions of books by authors, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
See, the thing is, I don't want to blow my own trumpet, but I'm coming up with my own book. I just signed a contract with Rupa Publications, just in fact yesterday morning. So I don't know how long it takes, but then I wrote the book for a common reader who does not know much about it. So it will take some time. But beyond that, I can, see, the thing is, when you talk about Shaddarsanas, there are several books. For instance, a book by one of the common books by Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, Indian Philosophies. I read that book. I read few other books by names doesn't come to mind, but I've listed them at the end of each chapter, the recommended reading for each darshana and recommended reading for the entire all darshanas in one book. I don't know, Ojaswiji, is there a way that I can share that at some point? We can maybe include it in the description of this talk at some point. So I'll do that. I'll send some references. You can include it. Yes, I'll include that. But regarding the Sanskrit, I recommend everybody to get some idea of Sanskrit because it's beautiful language. It is very logical. It is very scientific. And if you understand Sanskrit, it will sharpen your mind. You will get better at what you do. You don't have to take up a job to teach Sanskrit. Yeah, you can be an IT professional, you can be a medical doctor, you can be a civil servant, you can be an artist, and you will be better at that because your mind gets sharper by learning Sanskrit. So that's I think that answers your question.